remember Chip from Beauty and the Beast, the quirky and friendly 7-year-old boy who spent the past 10 years as a piece of tableware. Chip is one of the more interesting characters in the film, along with being one of the more kind-hearted ones. Though his mother warns him not to approach any strangers who may enter the castle, he still presents himself as a warm beverage for Belle's father, Maurice, when he arrived unexpectedly. And throughout the rest of the movie, he's nothing but helpful the few times we see him. And of course, we all know Chip as the son of Mrs. Potts, who also happened to be turned into a piece of tableware. Mrs. Potts came off equally as generous as Chip, thus making no one question whether or not the two were related. We were told that she was his mother, and because he is a Chip off the old block, pun intended, we never questioned it. But did you know that there is a theory floating around on the internet that is centered around the concept that Chip is actually not Mrs. Potts' child at all, and instead is the illegitimate son of the Enchantress? Now, I know what you're thinking. We were quick to brush this one off too. I mean, it just sounds ridiculous. But after exploring the theory and taking a closer look at some of the finer details throughout the movie, I have to say, we've kind of been convinced. The concept really does fit perfectly as to why the Enchantress held such disdain towards the prince in the first place, and why she would place such a drastic curse on him. I mean, think about things realistically for a moment. We know that Chip is 7 years old. As for Mrs. Potts, we are never given an actual age for her, but judging by her looks and her mannerisms, I feel like most people would agree that she's somewhere between 55 and 65 years old. That would mean that when Chip was born, Mrs. Potts would have been around 48. And science has told us that women tend to begin experiencing menopause at around the age of 45, which means it would be unlikely for Mrs. Potts to have actually given birth to Chip. It's not impossible, but it is very unlikely. When the original animated version of the film came out, there was a lot of speculation surrounding Chip, specifically due to the fact that he was younger than the amount of time that the inhabitants of the castle had been turned into various household appliances. A lot of people were curious as to whether or not that meant he was born before or after they were transformed. And I guess if the latter were the case, Mrs. Potts could have given birth to him. However, that answer just doesn't make any sense to us. Sure, teapots don't particularly have ages, so they wouldn't have any restrictions in that sense on being able to give birth, but it does have restrictions in the sense that she was a teapot. Teapots can't reproduce, plain and simple. Sentient or not, it just wouldn't be possible. This means that it's almost certain that Chip was born before the transformation. Not to mention that we can see him as a human child before being transformed in both the live-action reimagining as well as in the 1997 straight-to-VHS sequel, The Enchanted Christmas. So the only logical conclusion would be that once they were transformed, the aging process either stopped or slowed down dramatically. You see, we already know that time works differently within the castle than it does outside of the castle, at least to its inhabitants. Just think about the circumstances surrounding the curse that the Enchantress put on the prince. She said that the rose wouldn't start to wilt and wither away until the prince's 21st birthday. And by the time the movie actually begins, we find out that it has already started to wilt, meaning that the prince either turned 21 while being the beast, or he was already 21. To us though, it seems likely that he would have somehow turned 21 while being a beast. Otherwise, the rose would have started to die right away when the curse was placed, and she wouldn't have needed to place the age parameters in the first place. It would have just been redundant at that point. So, to us, that tells us that the people that had been transformed in the castle do, in fact, age. That would literally be the only way to explain Chip's age at the end of the movie, and the age that we see him as in the animated sequel, or even the beginning of the live-action version of the film. But if the inhabitants of the castle do in fact age just at an extremely slow pace, that also means that Mrs. Potts didn't age much either. Therefore, she would have already been fairly old to begin with, and most likely way too old at the time of Chip's birth to have been his mother. She might be acting as a sort of surrogate, but at this point in the reasoning, it's starting to seem highly unlikely that Mrs. Potts physically gave birth to Chip. Now, this begs the very big and important question. If Mrs. Potts isn't Chip's mother, and assuming that Mr. Potts isn't his father, then who are his parents? And now that we are talking about it, why in the world would they be lying about that information? I mean, it would have to be for someone important, right? If it was for one of the other servants or normal people around the castle, no one would have cared enough for there to be a cause to hide it, or to shelter it from the world. No, it would have had to have been someone who was powerful enough that having a child without being married, especially during that time, would have brought great shame to his name. Now, before we go further, let's just dispel this one quick loophole. I know one of the obvious answers might be that Chip was the child of someone related to Mrs. Potts that might have asked her to care for him, but that wouldn't be reason enough for him to think that she's his mother. If that were the case, he would likely refer to her as his grandmother or something of that nature. Plus, anyone related to Mrs. Potts would most likely be in the same social class as her family, and they wouldn't have to worry about having or hiding the fact that they had a child. So who in the world could have been Chip's father? Well, obviously, it would most likely have to be the prince. I mean, holy cow, they even look alike. Granted, the prince is much older and looks a lot more horrifying than Chip, but you cannot deny the similarities in their human forms. And I know you're going to say that the hair color is totally different, right? Wrong. Look at the kid's eyebrows. You don't have blonde hair like that naturally and then have deep brown eyebrows. It's just normally not how it works. There are countless examples of children that start off with a very blonde head of hair and eyebrows as a baby, only to grow and age and have their hair color darken both on their head and on their eyebrows, or sometimes just on their eyebrows. So either the animator's color palette messed up, or they are trying to tell us that they dyed this kid's hair blonde, perhaps to make him look less like the prince, whose hair is the same color as Chip's eyebrows. Regardless of genetics from his father's side, he could have easily inherited the blonde trait from his mother's side as well, which we will get to in a second. But I'm telling you, the more we look into this theory, the more eye-opening it becomes. It's like they were trying to make it almost obvious that Chip was the prince's son without mentioning it. I mean, in the animated sequel that we mentioned before, we see Chip, who is a tiny bit older than he was in the first movie. And who is he dressed like? The prince. He's wearing practically the same clothes as him, and it would line up with the timeline as well. I mean, if the prince wasn't 21 before being cursed, then that means he was at that age where a young prince is likely to get into some shenanigans. And back in those times, if shenanigans led to children before marriage, it didn't look good, especially with a person in a position of power, like the prince. So, if the prince is Chip's father, then who is his real mother? Since it obviously isn't Mrs. Potts. Well, and hear me out here, what if it was the Enchantress? Think about it. We don't really know much about who she is other than the fact that she is beautiful and capable of casting very strong curses. But why would she choose to curse this particular royal? And with such a dramatic and nasty curse for that matter. I know she said it was to teach him a lesson about learning not to judge people by their appearances, and that he needs to find love as a monster to be loved as a human. But if I'm being honest, that seems like the worst excuse I've ever heard. I mean, for one thing, why would she want to teach this particular prince that lesson? It's not like his actions have consequences for his kingdom. The dude disappeared for a decade and it didn't have any effect on the villages around his kingdom at all. So it couldn't have been to prove a point to anyone other than the prince himself, and possibly even herself. Her whole, "you didn't give me a room because I pretended to be someone I'm not, so now I curse you" thing just seemed a little weak. What it really looks like is a former lover who was cast aside being angry and jealous that she wasn't invited to the house party. So she pulled the classic "nobody will love you as I loved you" trope that we see in all sorts of movies, not even Disney related. And I know this might seem a bit far-fetched, but when you look back on the older telling of the Beauty and the Beast before the PG Disney film, you'll find out that the curse didn't have anything to do with the prince being stingy with the room or being selfish. In the very first version of the story, the Enchantress ended up planting the curse on the prince because he wouldn't succumb to her seductive ways. And out of pettiness, she cursed him for not wanting her. So what if in the Disney film, the Enchantress had actually been able to seduce the prince? I mean, they wouldn't mention it because, as we said a second ago, the PG rating. But if she did manage to seduce the prince, maybe she ended up getting pregnant. But when the prince informed her that the child wouldn't be named as theirs and would instead be raised by a servant, she went mad, which would have been understandable. I mean, that would also explain why the curse extended to the servants in the first place. She wanted revenge on the entire castle that cast her away and took her child from her. Come on, that sounds like a way better reason for cursing the prince than just not being able to stay at the castle for a night. I mean, if she was strong enough of an enchantress, I'm fairly certain she could have figured out another place to stay instead of a huge castle that was in the middle of an event. But a mother driven mad by the loss of her child to another family, that seems like a very solid reason to curse someone. Plus, it could explain the other side of Chip's physical features. It may explain why he has blonde hair and dispute the reasoning behind why he doesn't look exactly like the prince, only similar. Obviously, we have two sets of genetics we're dealing with here. I'm going to be honest, like I said before, that we really didn't think this theory held much weight before looking into it. But the more and more we looked and researched for this video, the more we are convinced. It just seems to fill up some of the issues with the plot that we once had. But what do you guys think? Do you think Chip was the child of the Enchantress or Mrs. Potts? Be sure to let us know in the comments down below. As for now, that's all Disney fans. Let us know what video you'd like to see next in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more magically packed videos.